At the Wray estate auction 2 miles outside Larkspur, Nebraska, on the last raw Saturday of March, Ada Marsh raised her hand into the wind and paid $9, every cent she owned in the world, for 2 winter-killed beehives that the auctioneer would not even promise held a single living bee. The yard erupted into laughter, and no one laughed louder or longer than Otis Fenwick, who ran the only general store within 15 miles, and who was still telling the story, with relish, to every farmer who came through his door a month later. Ada did not flinch. She counted the coins into the auctioneer's palm one at a time, the way she counted everything, took the scrap of paper that made the boxes legally hers, and walked back toward her wagon through a crowd of men still wiping their eyes. What none of them understood, not Fenwick, not the men slapping their knees, not even the neighbor woman who watched her go with more pity than amusement, was that Ada had walked past those same 2 boxes 4 days earlier, stacked behind the Wray tool shed, and had already lifted one lid, quietly, before the auction ever opened. She knew something the rest of Kestrel County did not know yet. It would be the better part of a year before they found it out. If you like the sound of a story where the arithmetic doesn't add up until it does, stay through this one. Tap the like button before we go on, and tell me down in the comments what state or country you're watching from tonight, because I do read them. Now let's go back to that Saturday morning, because the $9 only closed the first chapter of this story. Ada Marsh had come into that auction yard with a list in her coat pocket, written in pencil on the back of an old seed catalog, and not one item on that list was a beehive. She was not yet 30, and she had been proving up her own claim on the sandy ridge north of Larkspur for going on 4 years. 160 acres, the man at the land office had warned her, was thin ground, Miss Marsh, thin ground, and a long way from water. His polite way of saying nobody else had wanted it. She had wanted it anyway. It was hers to want under the law, unmarried and of age, and she had proved it the same as any man in that auction yard, 4 winters running, alone except for an aging mule named Jasper and a rough-coated yellow dog named Pip, who had wandered onto the claim, half-starved her second summer, and stayed. The first 2 of those 4 years had gone about as well as thin, sandy ridge ground goes, which is to say not particularly well, but well enough to get by on. It was the 3rd year that had nearly finished her. That was the summer the grasshoppers came. Not the ordinary scattering a person shrugged at, but a cloud thick enough to dim the sun at 2 in the afternoon, a moving brown weight that came down out of a clear sky in July and stripped her wheat to bare stubble in 11 hours. Ate the leaves off her young fruit trees, ate the handles off 2 rakes leaned against the shed wall, ate, people swore and half meant it, the wool off a sheep's back 3 farms over. Ada had stood in the doorway of her claim shanty and watched 4 years of careful work disappear into a sound like rain that never let up, and by the time the cloud lifted and moved east to ruin someone else's summer, she had nothing left standing in the ground worth harvesting, and a root cellar with perhaps 6 weeks of food in it going into a Nebraska winter. She had survived that winter on credit. Store credit, specifically, Otis Fenwick's credit, extended in careful pencil figures in the ledger he kept behind the till. Flour and salt pork and coal oil and thread and the seed corn she'd need again come spring. All of it carried forward the way homesteaders across Kestrel County carried a balance through a hard season, on the understanding it would be settled once there was something to sell. Fenwick was not, in the ordinary run of things, an unkind man about it. He carried worse accounts than hers for longer, but he had also made it plain the previous autumn, his pencil resting flat on the page, that her balance had reached $17.65, and that he expected it settled in full by the first snow of the coming winter, or he would have no choice but to close her book. No more flour on credit, no more coal oil, no more anything. Hard for a woman 11 miles from the next store, in a county where a closed account traveled on its own legs and arrived before you did. $17.65. It was written on that same pencil list, underneath the seed corn, because Ada wrote everything down. She had learned it from nobody in particular. It was simply the way her mind worked. Ada kept a ledger, a real one, leather-bound, going on its 3rd year of her own small, careful handwriting, and she trusted the numbers in it more than she trusted most people's memory of what they'd said, her own included. So she had come to the Wray auction that Saturday with $9 sewn into the lining of her glove, the last of what a winter of her own hen's eggs and a little sewing work for the Colby family had brought her, with exactly one plan in mind: to buy back a share of the seed corn she would need for spring planting, because her own stores were thin, and the Wray place, whose owner had died over the winter, was auctioning off a full season's worth of farm goods his son back east had neither the use nor the patience to haul home. Simeon Wray had farmed the river bottom outside Larkspur for the better part of 30 years, a quiet, particular old man who kept to himself, ran a decent herd, and, as it turned out, though almost nobody in the county had paid it much mind while he was alive, kept 2 hives of bees behind his orchard in the newer style his own father had taught him, built around movable wooden frames rather than the woven straw skeps most of the county's handful of beekeepers still favored. Wray had died in February, in his sleep, of nothing more dramatic than 70-odd hard winters catching up to a body all at once, and his son had come out from Ohio in early March, just long enough to arrange the estate sale and go home again, wanting nothing to do with a Nebraska farm he had no intention of ever working himself. The auction started at 9 that morning with the big items: the plow, the harrow, a decent wagon, 6 head of cattle, a mule Ada would have liked a closer look at if she'd had money to spare, and worked its way down through the smaller lots as the morning wore on. Ezra Pike ran the sale, as he ran most sales in that end of the county, a wiry, fast-talking man who moved through the lots without much ceremony and had a genuine gift for making 30 seconds of silence feel like a personal insult to everyone standing in it. Ada waded through the cattle and the tools and a milk cow that went for $14 to a family from the north end of the county, watching the crowd the way she always watched a crowd when money was involved, reading who wanted what and how badly. When Pike finally called the seed corn lot, 4 bushels, good clean seed, no weevil in it, she raised her hand at the opening bid of $6 and held it as the number climbed, dollar by dollar, because she needed that corn and had budgeted every cent of the $9 in her glove around the certainty that 4 bushels from a dead man's well-run farm would go for $8, 9 at the outside, and she would carry it home in triumph and never think about beehives at all. She had budgeted wrong. Rufus Deakins, who farmed the section next to the Wray place and had been eyeing that same seed corn since before the sale opened, put in at $10 without so much as a pause, and when Ada raised her own hand at 11, the very top of what she could spend and still call herself sensible, Deakins grinned in the way of a man who already knows he has won, and raised his hand again. $11.50, Pike called. Do I hear 12? Ada did not have 12. She stood there with her hand still half raised and felt the seed corn go, and felt, underneath the plain disappointment, the colder arithmetic of what it meant. No corn from the sale, which meant buying seed corn off Fenwick's shelf instead, on credit, adding to a balance she had promised herself she would only ever bring down between now and the first snow, never up. Tough luck, Miss Marsh, Deakins said, not unkindly exactly, in the way of a man who doesn't mean to be cruel, but enjoys saying a thing like that anyway. Should have come with deeper pockets. She said nothing. She had learned, over 4 years of standing in rooms full of men discussing her business, as though she weren't standing directly in front of them, that saying nothing cost her nothing and said everything she needed said. It was while she stood there, still holding her $9 and watching Deakins's wagon get loaded, that her eye drifted toward the back corner of the Wray dooryard, where 2 weathered wooden boxes sat stacked against the tool shed, half forgotten, a scrap of paper tacked to the top one that read, in Pike's own hand, Lot 41, bee gums, condition as is, bees dead. She had noticed those boxes 3 days before, when she'd come out to walk the property ahead of the sale, the way she always did, reading a farm before she ever bid on anything in it, a habit that had saved her money more than once and cost her nothing but shoe leather. She had stopped at the tool shed corner mostly out of idle curiosity, having never in her life stood this close to a proper Langstroth hive rather than the woven skep her own mother had once kept behind a kitchen garden in Ohio, back when Ada was a girl too small to be trusted anywhere near it. She had lifted the lid of the top box, carefully, expecting nothing, and had seen, in the gray early spring light, before she understood what she was looking at or why any of it mattered. Row after row of pale, empty, perfectly built honeycomb hanging clean and whole inside wooden frames that lifted free of the box without tearing or breaking, exactly the way a little folded pamphlet in her mother's old recipe box had once described a proper movable-frame hive working. A pamphlet Ada had read so many times as a girl that whole sentences of it still sat in her memory like a half-forgotten hymn. She had not known, standing there 3 days before the sale, exactly what that comb was worth. She had only known it was not nothing, and she had filed the thought away and gone home and turned it over for 3 days while she finished her other chores, the way she turned over every number that ever crossed her ledger. Now, standing in the trampled yard with the seed corn gone to Rufus Deakins and $9 still sewn into her glove, she watched Pike work his way down through the last of the small lots, some worn harness, a broken churn, a crate of canning jars, toward the back corner of the dooryard, toward Lot 41, and she felt the whole shape of the morning quietly rearrange itself, the way a plan does when it finally has somewhere to go. "Lot 41, Pike called out, not troubling to hide his own amusement. 2 bee gums, condition as is, can't promise you a single bee alive in either one. The Wray boy tells me they were dead and silent when he found them back in February, and I'd guess he's right, seeing as it's still March and nothing's flying yet regardless. Floor's 50 cents. Do I hear 50 cents for 2 dead boxes?" A ripple of laughter went through what remained of the crowd. Somebody near the front, it might have been Deakins himself, flush with his seed corn, called out that Pike ought to just burn the pair of them for kindling and save everyone the ceremony of a bid. Ada raised her hand. 50 cents, I have it, Pike said, blinking at her with mild surprise. Do I hear 75? Silence, and then a little more laughter, the kind that comes when a crowd senses something is about to turn into entertainment rather than commerce. $9, Ada said. The yard went quiet for exactly as long as it takes 40 people to decide they've misheard something, and then it did not stay quiet at all. Pike actually read the number back to her twice, the second time slower, the way a man double-checks a figure he's certain must be a mistake. And both times Ada answered the same, flat and clear enough to carry across the whole yard, $9. It was Otis Fenwick's laugh that rose loudest above the rest of it, a big, carrying, performing kind of laugh Ada had heard often enough across his own store counter to recognize instantly. $9, he repeated, to nobody in particular, and to everybody at once, wiping at his eyes. $9 for 2 dead boxes Simeon Wray himself would have paid somebody 50 cents to haul off his property. Lord, Miss Marsh, if you've got $9 burning that bad a hole in your glove, I'll gladly take it off your hands for something that isn't already deceased. Rufus Deakins, still standing by his wagon load of seed corn, laughed loudest of the farmers, calling out something about how at least his corn would grow into a crop which drew its own fresh round from the men nearest him. Even Iris Colby, standing near the fence rail with her husband Warren, who had never once been unkind to Ada in 4 years of being her nearest neighbors, put a gloved hand up to her mouth in an expression that was not quite laughter and not quite sympathy either, the look of a woman watching another woman do something she cannot begin to understand, and worrying for her a little. Ada let it run its course. She had found, over 4 years of being the only unmarried woman working her own claim in that stretch of Kestrel County, that a crowd's laughter was a kind of weather. You could not stop it by arguing with it, only stand still and let it pass over you and go on with what you had come to do. Pike, once the noise finally settled enough for him to be heard, looked at her with something that was almost respect buried underneath his own confusion, shrugged, and brought his gavel down. Sold to Miss Marsh for $9. He said it in the same flat voice he'd have used to close a fair price on good stock, which was, in its own small way, the first moment all morning anyone had treated the transaction as ordinary business rather than a joke, and Ada noticed it, and was grateful for it in a manner she did not have occasion to say aloud to anyone. There was one man in that yard who had not laughed at all, and Ada noticed that too, though she did not know his name yet and would not learn it for the better part of a week. He was an old man, broad through the shoulders, even bent a little now with age, standing off toward the fence line in a coat heavier than the weather called for, and while the rest of the yard had doubled over, he had simply watched her with something between curiosity and a kind of private recognition, as though he alone in that whole trampled dooryard understood exactly what she had just paid $9 for and did not find it the least bit funny. He did not approach her. He did not say a single word. But she caught his eye once, across the grass, and something about the stillness of his face stayed with her longer than all of Fenwick's laughing put together. She paid Pike the $9, coin by coin, out of the glove she had sewn the lining into the week before for exactly that purpose, and signed the scrap of paper that made Lot 41 legally hers, and she and Jasper loaded the 2 boxes onto the flatbed of her wagon, while what remained of the crowd drifted off toward their own teams, still talking, still amused. The story of the woman who had paid $9 for 2 dead bee boxes, already taking the shape it would keep for months, growing a little larger in the telling every time it changed hands, the way stories about a person's failures always seem to travel faster and grow fatter than stories about their successes. She did not talk to Jasper on the ride home, which was unusual for her. She talked to him plenty on ordinary days, the low-running commentary of a woman who has spent 4 winters more or less alone and has found that a mule, unlike most of Kestrel County, does not offer unsolicited opinions about her business. But that afternoon she rode home in silence, watching the 2 boxes shift gently against their ropes, feeling the particular hollowed-out lightness of having exactly no money left in the world, and a great deal riding, in every sense of the word, on 2 wooden crates that most of the county had just finished laughing at. She passed Fenwick's store on the way out of town, its front window catching the flat afternoon light, and she thought, without any particular bitterness, only arithmetic, of the $17.65 still owed against that window, and the first snow that was 8 months off and would arrive regardless of whether she was ready to meet it. She thought, too, though she could not have said exactly why, of her mother's old skep behind the Ohio kitchen garden, and the low, steady hum that used to drift across that yard on a warm afternoon, and the way her mother, dead now 9 years, had never once seemed afraid of the thing everyone else in that county also considered dangerous, unpredictable, and best left entirely alone. She reached her own claim as the light was going long and gold across the ridge, unhitched Jasper, and carried the 2 boxes one at a time to a cleared spot near the corner of her shanty, where the ground sat flat and the morning sun would strike first. Pip circled the boxes twice, sniffed carefully at the seams with the particular seriousness dogs bring to anything new in the yard, and lost interest. Ada did not lose interest, not for a moment. She stood over the 2 boxes as the last of the daylight went the color of wheat that no longer grew in her own fields, and she thought about the frames of pale comb she had seen 3 days earlier, and about $17.65, and about $9, and about a whole county that had just finished laughing at her twice in the same morning, once for the corn she hadn't gotten, and once for the boxes she had. She did not open the lids that evening. It was near dark, and she had learned enough, even from a girlhood pamphlet and a half-remembered mother, to know that a proper look at what she had actually bought deserved better light than a dying Saturday could give her. Tomorrow, she told herself, latching the shed door against the evening chill. Tomorrow she would know exactly what $9 had bought her, and exactly how much work stood between what she owned tonight and what she meant to have a year from now. She went inside, lit the lamp, and opened her ledger to a fresh page. At the top, in her own small, careful hand, she wrote the date, and beneath it, 2 hives, lot 41, Wray Estate, $9. Beneath that, she left the rest of the page blank, because she did not yet know what else belonged on it. Only that something would, and that she intended to fill every line. Word of the $9 reached Larkspur before Ada's own wagon wheels had finished drying out from the morning dew, the way word of anything foolish or unusual always seemed to outrun the actual people involved in it. By Monday, when Ada rode in for a spool of thread she genuinely needed, she understood from the particular quality of the quiet that fell over the 3 men loitering at Fenwick's counter that they had already heard, and had already decided what they thought about it, and were simply waiting to see whether she would give them the satisfaction of looking embarrassed. She did not give them the satisfaction. She bought her thread, paid the 4 cents for it in exact coin, thanked Fenwick with the same level courtesy she used for every transaction in that store, and left. It was, she would reflect later, a fairly ordinary Monday, notable only for how many people found a reason to be standing near a window when she rode past. She was under no illusion about what the next several months were likely to hold. A county that had laughed once at a $9 bid was a county that would keep laughing in smaller and larger ways for as long as the joke kept paying dividends in gossip, and Ada had exactly one answer for that, which was the same answer she had for most things: work, and the ledger, and time, in that order, and the stubborn private conviction, not yet proven, not yet even fully understood by the woman holding it, that she had looked at something everyone else in Kestrel County had walked straight past, and had seen, underneath the ridicule, the shape of what it might actually become. She did not know yet how right she was. She only knew, riding home that Monday with her spool of thread and her 4 remaining pennies, that the 2 boxes were waiting for her, and that tomorrow's light would be better than today's, and that a year is a very long time to prove a person wrong. The Sunday morning light came in clean and cold and exactly right, and Ada carried her father's old paint scraper and a kitchen knife out to the 2 boxes before she had even finished her coffee, because she had lain awake a good portion of the night rehearsing what she might find and had run out of patience for waiting on it. She pried the lid of the first box loose slowly, bracing herself, without entirely knowing what she was bracing for. She had read enough, even in a girlhood pamphlet, to know that a dead colony could mean 2 very different things, and that one was nothing to fear, and the other was a thing careful beekeepers spoke of in the same low voice they used for blight or glanders. A sickness in the brood called foulbrood, which could smell strong enough to turn a stomach at 10 paces, and which meant burning the frames rather than saving a single one. She lifted the lid the rest of the way, and leaned in close and breathed deliberately. There was no foul smell. There was only a faint, dry, sweetish scent of old wax and old honey, and beneath it, nothing at all. No rot, no sourness, nothing that made her step back. She let her breath out slowly and looked properly for the first time at what $9, and Simeon Wray's 30 years of careful work before her, had actually bought. Inside the box, 10 wooden frames hung in a neat row, each one lifting free of its neighbor with a half-inch of open air on every side, and each one filled edge to edge with pale golden comb built as straight and even as anything Ada had ever seen a human hand produce on purpose. Near the center of the cluster of frames, a small huddle of dead bees sat packed together in the empty cells, heads down, exactly where they had been reaching for stores that had run out before the cold did. It was a plain, quiet kind of death, the kind that came from nothing more sinister than a hard winter and a colony too small or too poorly provisioned to outlast it, and Ada understood, looking at it, that she was looking at simple winterkill and nothing worse. The ordinary risk every beekeeper in that county ran every February, not a disease that would cost her the whole investment before she'd even begun. She did not know yet, standing there in the cold Sunday light, exactly how she knew the difference. She only knew that the comb itself was the thing worth $9, worth far more if what she remembered from that old pamphlet was true, because a colony of bees did not build comb the way a person built a fence, quickly and out of whatever lumber was handy. A colony built comb out of its own body, secreting wax from glands along its underside a scale at a time, and it took, by the old reckoning, her mother's pamphlet had printed at the bottom of a page Ada had read 100 times as a girl, something in the neighborhood of 6 or 8 pounds of honey consumed and burned as fuel to produce a single pound of that wax. 10 frames of drawn comb, then, sitting here in a box everyone at the Wray auction had called worthless, represented not lumber and not labor exactly, but weeks of a colony's entire working life, converted into a shape that a new colony, any new colony, arriving with nothing of its own, could simply move into and begin filling with honey the very first afternoon, rather than spending its whole first month building the shelves before it had anywhere to put anything on them. That was the thing nobody laughing in that auction yard had understood. Bees were never truly the scarce thing on a Nebraska homestead in March. Wild swarms found their own way into hollow trees and abandoned barns every summer, free for the taking to anyone patient enough to go looking, and Ada already had a fair guess that Kestrel County held more homeless bees than anyone had ever bothered to count. What was scarce, what took a whole season and a great deal of ruined effort to build from nothing, was exactly what sat inside these 2 boxes: comb. Simeon Ray's bees had died. Simeon Ray's labor stored in wax had not. The second box told the same story as the first: 10 more frames of good drawn comb and a smaller, sadder cluster of dead bees near the middle of it, and Ada spent the better part of that Sunday morning going through both boxes, frame by frame, lifting each one into the light, turning it, checking the cappings, looking for anything that told her the story was worse than it appeared. She tested 2 suspect cells the way the pamphlet had described, working a thin splinter of wood down into the small, dark residue at the bottom of each, and drawing it slowly back out, watching for the telltale rope of brown matter that would have told her the colony died of disease rather than hunger and cold. Both times the splinter came out clean. Both times she felt something in her chest loosen a little further. By noon, she had cleaned every frame of loose debris, scraped the burr comb and the small deposits of dark, sticky propolis the bees had used to seal every crack the way a homesteader chinked a cabin wall against the wind, and set both boxes up on a pair of low stands. She built that afternoon out of scrap lumber, angled slightly forward so rain would run off rather than pool against the entrance. She calculated that evening, spent nothing more on the operation so far than the $9 already in her ledger, and perhaps 30 minutes of a Sunday she would otherwise have spent mending a torn hem. What she had, at the close of that first full day of ownership, was 2 clean, sound, well-built wooden hives, full of the one thing a beekeeper could not simply buy at Fenwick's counter for any price he cared to name, and not a single living bee to put in either one. The following week, Ada rode into Larkspur for 2 things she genuinely needed and could not build herself: a length of fine cheesecloth netting for a veil, and enough new pine to true up the handful of frames whose top bars had cracked or warped past, saving over however many winters those boxes had stood behind the Wray tool shed. The netting cost her 35 cents. The pine and a small paper of nails came to 60 cents more. She wrote both figures into the ledger beneath the $9 and did the arithmetic without flinching because 95 cents against $17.65 still owed was not a number that frightened her, not yet, not when she had a clear use in mind for every penny of it. Fenwick weighed out the netting himself and could not resist asking, with the good humor of a man who has already decided the answer will amuse him, what exactly a person did with cheesecloth and dead bees. "You planning on straining them, Miss Marsh?" he said, and two farmers waiting on their own orders laughed loud enough that Ada heard it clear across the store. She told him evenly that she was building a veil and left it at that, because she had learned there was very little profit in explaining a plan to a man who had already decided it would fail. Rufus Deakins was in the store that same afternoon and made a point of asking after her bee farm in a tone that suggested the two words did not belong within a mile of each other, and wondered aloud whether she meant to charge admission to look at the boxes, seeing as that was apparently the only thing likely to come of them. Ada bought her netting, thanked Fenwick, and rode home with the particular tight, contained feeling in her chest that she had learned over 4 hard years not to let show on her face in town. It was 2 days after that ride into town that the old man from the auction yard appeared at her fence line on foot, leading a small cart with a covered basket lashed to it, and stood there long enough that Pip had worked himself into a full frenzy of barking before Ada came out to see what the commotion was. "You are Marsh," he said, in an accent that laid its weight on certain words in a way Ada placed after a moment as German, though softened by what she guessed was a good many years on this side of the ocean. "I am Otto Brandt. I farm the section past the Colby place on the River Road." He did not offer his hand or wait for an invitation before continuing. "I did not laugh at the auction. I want you to know this, in case it matters to you." It mattered to her more than she let show. She invited him in as far as the fence rail, at least, and he came no farther on his first visit, standing with one hand resting on his cart the whole time, as though he might need to leave suddenly, though nothing in his manner suggested he was in any hurry at all. He had kept bees himself, he told her, back in the old country as a young man, and again for some years after he came to Nebraska, skeps mostly, the old woven straw kind his own father and grandfather had kept before him until his wife Liesel, who had been the one who truly loved the bees more than he ever had himself, had died of a fever 11 years before, and he had let the last of his own hives go empty rather than tend them without her. He still had 2 of the old skeps in his barn, sound enough, never used since, and he had heard the story of the $9 from 3 separate people inside of 2 days, and had decided that whatever the rest of the county believed, a woman willing to pay real money for good-drawn comb and dead bees at a public auction was not a woman who needed anyone's pity, only perhaps someone who had done the work before and would not mind answering a few honest questions. "Foulbrood," he said when she told him what she had found and how she had tested for it. "You did the right test. If it comes out clean twice, you are almost certainly right. But I will look myself, if you will let me, because 2 sets of eyes catch more than one, and it is better to know for certain now than to guess wrong in June." She let him look. He walked the 2 boxes slowly, lifted 3 frames apiece, held each one up to the light exactly as she had, and pronounced them, at the end of 20 careful minutes, as clean a pair of winter-killed hives as he had seen in years. A small colony each, he guessed, likely weakened going into the cold by a wet autumn or a queen already failing, unable to cluster tight enough to hold its own warmth through the worst of February, dead of cold and hunger together rather than of any sickness that would spread or spoil. "Simeon Wray was careless the last year or 2, Otto said, not unkindly, the way one old farmer speaks of another who is past defending himself. His hands had gone bad with the joints. He should have combined these 2 colonies into one strong one in the autumn, and he did not. And so you have 2 dead colonies with good comb instead of one strong live one. His loss, and now your gain, if you know what you are about." She told him honestly. that she did not entirely know what she was about. Not yet. And he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was coming to recognize as his particular way of deciding something, and then told her simply that swarm season would begin in earnest by the middle of May, that a swarm in May was worth a load of hay, a swarm in June a silver spoon, and a swarm caught in July was hardly worth the chasing, and that if she wanted, he would teach her what he still remembered, in exchange for nothing more than the company, and perhaps a taste of whatever she eventually made of it. Otto came back 3 times over the following 2 weeks, always in the cooler part of the afternoon, always leaving before dark, and each visit he taught her something the pamphlet in her mother's recipe box had only half explained. He showed her, with his thumb and forefinger held a scant distance apart, what the pamphlet had called bee space, and what he called, in his own English, the gap the bees will not fill, a passage of somewhere near 3/8 of an inch, no more and no less, that a colony of honeybees would leave open rather than seal, out of some instinct nobody living had ever fully explained. Leave a gap smaller than that between 2 surfaces inside a hive, and the bees would caulk it shut with propolis, the dark sticky resin they gathered from tree buds, gluing frame to frame and frame to wall until nothing could be lifted without tearing the whole hive apart. Leave a gap larger than that, and they would fill it the opposite way, with soft new comb built to bridge the space, just as troublesome to a beekeeper trying to inspect his own hive. But hold to that narrow measure precisely, as the man named Langstroth had worked out by patient trial years before Otto himself had ever left Germany, and the bees would leave the space open on its own, every time, and a beekeeper could lift any single frame clean out of the hive, inspect it, replace it, and disturb almost nothing else in the colony's life. "This is the whole of it," Otto told her, tapping the hive box with one knuckle. "Not the wood, not the paint, the gap. Everything else is only carpentry built around one correct measurement." He told her, too, plainly, what beekeepers before Langstroth's time had generally done when they wanted the honey out of a skep like the 2 still sitting unused in his own barn. They killed the colony first, over a pit of burning sulfur dug into the ground beneath the hive, because a fixed skep with no movable parts could not be opened and inspected and taken from a little at a time the way Ada's 2 boxes could. It was not cruelty exactly, only the only method anyone had for hundreds of years, and it meant that every skep harvested was a colony ended, every autumn, the good bees and the bad luck along with the honey. And the following spring a beekeeper started over from nothing but a fresh swarm if he was lucky enough to catch one. "This," he said, gesturing at Ada's 2 boxes with a kind of quiet respect she had not expected from him. "You can open every week if you like, all summer, all your life, and never kill a single bee for it unless you choose to. That is what Simeon Wray owned, and what half this county is still too proud to learn the value of." He taught her, on his second visit, to read a frame the way he had once read them himself. The pattern of capped brood near the center, tight and solid if the queen was healthy and laying well, spotty and scattered if something had gone wrong with her. The crescent of pollen, bright yellow and orange, and sometimes a startling blue, packed into the cells just outside the brood. And above and around all of it, the honey itself, capped white or pale gold when it was cured and ready, glistening and uncapped when it was still too green and thin to keep. He taught her the 2 different shapes a queen cell could take, hanging like a small peanut off the bottom edge of a frame when a colony was strong and crowded and preparing to swarm, or built flatter and more central on the comb's face when an old queen was failing and the colony meant only to replace her quietly without ever leaving home. It was, Ada thought, listening to him with her ledger open on her knee, very nearly a whole language, one she had lived 4 years within a day's ride of and never once been taught to read. Otto's memory went only so far, and he suggested on that same visit that Ada write away for one of the printed guides now sold by beekeeping supply houses back east. Fenwick placed the order with his next shipment, and it cost her $1.10 plus postage. Real money to a woman who'd started the year with $9 total to her name. The book came up from Chicago 6 weeks later, a plain cloth-bound volume on movable frame management, and Ada read it twice by lamplight, checking every page against what Otto had already shown her, and found the two agreed on nearly everything that mattered. It was in that same book that she first read the fuller history of Lorenzo Langstroth himself, a minister who had worked out the whole principle of the bee space in his own backyard through years of patient, unpaid observation nobody had asked him to make. By his third visit in the last week of April, Otto brought the smaller of his two old straw skeps down from his barn on the bed of his cart, along with a coil of new rope and a promise. "For catching," he said, setting it down carefully in her dooryard. "A swarm will go into an old skep as happily as into your fine wooden boxes, and it is easier to carry up a ladder or through brush than a frame hive would be. You catch it in this, and then you bring it home, and you shake it in front of one of your own hives, in front of the good comb, and it will walk in on its own 2 feet, and never look back at the skep again." He would not take payment for the loan of it, though she offered, and would not take payment for any of the 3 afternoons he had spent teaching her, though she offered that too, and was refused, gently but with a finality that told her not to try a third time. Through the last cold evenings of April, Ada kept to a routine that would not have looked, to anyone watching from outside her small window, like very much of anything. A woman at a plank table by lamplight, a ledger open, a scatter of wooden frames laid across a cloth, a hive tool moving slowly along each one, scraping wax and propolis into a tin she had set aside for that purpose. Because even the scrapings, Otto had told her, were worth rendering down eventually into small cakes of beeswax that always found a buyer somewhere, if only at the general store for candle making. She kept the ledger open on the table beside her every one of those evenings, adding to it in small, steady entries, 35 cents for netting, 60 cents for pine and nails, $1.10 for the mail-order book, a dozen small figures that on their own looked like nothing, and that she nonetheless recorded with the same care she gave every larger sum, because she had learned, doing the household accounts alone for 4 years, that the small figures were the ones a person forgot to track, and the ones that quietly ruined an otherwise sound plan if left unwatched. Against those figures she had, as yet, nothing at all in the way of income, only the 2 clean boxes standing outside in the cold and the promise of May, still 3 weeks off, and she found she did not mind the waiting nearly as much as she had expected to, because for the first time since the grasshopper summer, she had a clear, specific thing to be waiting for, rather than simply waiting for the next disaster to declare itself. She thought, some of those evenings, about her mother, in a way she had not allowed herself to for a long while. She remembered watching, as a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, her mother walk out to the old skep behind their Ohio kitchen garden on a warm evening, with no veil at all, humming under her breath, and lift the whole straw basket an inch or 2 off its stand just to listen to the sound coming from inside it, and set it back down again, satisfied, the way another woman might check on bread rising in the oven. Ada had asked her once whether she wasn't afraid of being stung, and her mother had said only that the bees knew the difference between a hand that meant them harm and a hand that didn't, and that fear was the one thing they could smell on a person faster than smoke. Ada had not thought of that particular afternoon in 15 years. She thought of it 3 separate evenings that April, turning a cleaned frame over in the lamplight, and found that some of what she had assumed, standing in the Wray dooryard with $9 in her glove, was courage or calculation had actually been something closer to memory, a thing her hands seemed to know before the rest of her had caught up to it. She chose the apiary site with more care than she had given almost any other decision on the claim, walking the ground near her shanty 3 separate mornings before she settled on a shallow, sheltered dip a stone's throw from the well, backed on its north and west sides by the low-rise that broke the worst of the spring wind, close enough to a thin seasonal creek that the bees would have water without a long flight to find it, and open to the first direct sun of the morning, which Otto had told her mattered more than almost anything else, because bees that woke early to warm sunlight began their days foraging early, and a colony that worked longer hours in June made more honey by August than the same colony sitting in cold shade until noon. She set both boxes on their stands in that hollow in the last week of April, faced them southeast the way Otto had shown her, propped a shingle of scrap wood over each entrance as a rain guard, and stood back to look at the whole small, hopeful arrangement in the fading light. 2 clean hives, 10 frames of drawn comb in each, not one living bee in either. Close to $1.40 spent beyond the $9, $17.65 still owed at Fenwick's counter, and 3 weeks by Otto's reckoning, until the first swarms of the season began looking for exactly what she had built for them. She wrote the date in her ledger that night, and beneath it a single line that was not a figure at all, though she underlined it the way she underlined her sums. Ready, waiting on May. The swarm came on the second Tuesday of May, 9 days earlier than Otto had predicted, in his own orchard rather than hers, which was how Ada came to be standing on a borrowed ladder in Otto Brandt's apple trees at 4 o'clock on a warm afternoon, with her heart going harder than she cared to admit. Otto had sent his hired boy running the 1.5 miles to her claim with nothing but 4 words. "Come now, they're clustering." And Ada had dropped the hoe she was working with and ridden Jasper bareback rather than lose the time hitching him to anything, arriving to find Otto standing at the base of a low-bearing tree, one hand raised for quiet, looking up into the branches at a sight Ada had never once seen with her own eyes, though she had heard it described 3 times over the past 2 weeks. A swarm, several thousand bees strong, hanging in a dense, softly humming, football-shaped cluster from a branch no higher than Ada's own shoulder once she climbed 2 rungs of the ladder. They came out of the old cottonwood down by the creek, Otto said, low because the moment itself seemed to call for it. A wild colony, most likely, living in the hollow of it for years, nobody the wiser. Half the hive has gone out with the old queen to find a new home. The other half stays behind with a new one in the tree. This is the gift the tree gave up. Now we take it gently before they decide on their own where to go next. He explained it to her as they worked, keeping his voice low and even, that a swarm of bees in this particular state, heavy, clustered between one home and the next, was very nearly the safest a person could ever hope to find them, because every bee in that cluster had gorged itself full of honey before ever leaving the old hive, exactly the way a family leaving a burning house carries out an armful of what it can, and a bee too full of honey to bend easily at the middle was a bee with very little inclination or room left to sting. They had no home yet to defend, no brood to protect, nothing in that whole humming cluster but the honey in their stomachs and the queen somewhere near its center. And so they hung there, docile as Ada would ever see honeybees behave in her life, waiting on scouts already out searching the countryside for a hollow tree or an old skep, or, if fortune ran their way, 2 clean wooden boxes with good drawn comb sitting in a sheltered dip a stone's throw from a creek. Ada held Otto's borrowed skep beneath the branch, cupped in both hands the way he had shown her, while he reached up with a pruning saw and, with one clean stroke just above the cluster, cut the branch free and guided the whole humming mass down into the basket in a single controlled motion that looked, to Ada's eye, both impossibly gentle and impossibly bold at once. A portion of the cluster broke loose and fell rather than being guided, landing in a soft drift across her sleeves and the backs of her hands. And she held perfectly still, the way Otto had told her to, and felt several thousand bees crawling across her bare skin without once feeling a single sting, which struck her, standing there in the dappled orchard light, as very nearly the strangest and most wonderful thing that had happened to her in 4 years on that claim. They set the skep down in the shade at the base of the tree, entrance open, and within minutes, bees still clinging to the cut branch and to Ada's sleeves began walking, unhurried, toward the basket's opening, fanning their wings at the entrance in a way Otto told her was the colony calling its stragglers home, spreading a scent from a gland near the tip of the abdomen that told every bee still searching exactly where the rest of the family had gone. By evening, every bee that meant to join the new home had joined it, and Otto helped her load the skep, quiet now and settled, onto the bed of her wagon for the ride back to her own claim. She hived them that same evening, in the last of the daylight, laying a wide board as a ramp from the ground up to the entrance of her first box. The stronger-looking of Simeon Wray's 2 dead hives, the one with the least frame damage and the most even comb, and giving the skep one sharp, decisive shake over the top of the ramp, dumping the whole cluster out in a startled humming mass that took perhaps 30 seconds to organize itself and begin marching in a broad, unhurried column, up the board and through the entrance and into the waiting comb beyond. Ada stood watching them go, hardly breathing, until the very last straggling bee had walked itself inside and the entrance had gone quiet and ordinary-looking, exactly like any hive that had stood in that spot its whole working life. She wrote in her ledger that night by lamplight, hands still faintly sticky with hive smell. First swarm, hived this evening, box A. Cost, nothing but the day. Value, everything. She brought Otto a jar of her own preserved plums the following week by way of thanks he would not accept in cash, and found him in his own kitchen for the first time, a spare room that still held a woman's careful touch, 11 years gone and unchanged. He talked that afternoon, more than she'd heard him talk in all his visits combined, about Liesel, about the skeps they'd kept together their first 10 years in Nebraska, about a June morning a swarm had settled in the crown of a hat she'd left on a fence post. Ada understood she was being given something closer to the last evidence of a marriage's quiet happiness than mere instruction, and said only that she was glad to know it. It became, without either of them naming it, a standing habit through that whole first summer. Preserves or honey traded for advice and labor, and, increasingly, simple company. 2 people who had each ended up alone on that stretch of prairie, finding in a shared patience for bees something neither had expected to find again. Ada thought of it as nothing more complicated than good neighboring, and so far as she could tell, did Otto. She gave the new colony a full 10 days before disturbing it at all, on Otto's advice, time enough for the bees to settle their new home, begin drawing what fresh comb they needed, and put the queen to laying in earnest, and she spent those 10 days finishing the one piece of equipment she still lacked entirely, a smoker. She could not afford, and would not in any case have found for sale anywhere within a day's ride of Larkspur, one of the fine bellows-fitted tin smokers Otto described from his own younger years, so she built her own out of a battered coffee tin with a hinged lid, a scrap of leather cut and tacked into a crude bellows on one side, and a handful of small holes punched through the tin's face to let the smoke draw properly. She learned, mostly by ruining 2 attempts, that the fuel mattered more than the tin itself, that green wood or fresh grass only smoldered bitter and hot and did the colony more harm than good, while old, punky, half-rotted wood pulled from the underside of a fallen cottonwood, packed loosely enough to breathe, produced the thing she actually wanted, a cool, thick, white smoke that did not scorch a single wing. She worked the hive for the first time on a warm, still midday in the last week of May, choosing the hour deliberately, because midday was when the greatest number of a colony's field bees were away foraging, and the hive itself was at its calmest, holding only the house bees and the brood and the queen, none of them inclined to trouble a careful visitor. She settled her homemade veil over her hat, tied it snug at the collar, and gave 2 slow puffs of cool smoke across the entrance before she ever touched the lid, waiting a full minute for the smoke to do its quiet work. Masking, Otto had explained, the alarm scent the guard bees released at the first sign of disturbance, and triggering instead an older, calmer instinct, the same one that told a colony a fire was coming, and the sensible thing to do was gorge on honey and prepare to evacuate rather than fight. She lifted the first frame with her hands only faintly unsteady, and found precisely what Otto had taught her to look for: a broad, tight, unbroken pattern of capped brood across the comb's center, the telltale sign of a young, vigorous, well-mated queen laying without gaps or hesitation, ringed by a bright crescent of stored pollen, and, along the frame's upper corners, the first pale beginnings of new capped honey. She found no queen cells at all on that first inspection, which Otto told her, when she described it to him 2 days later, was exactly right for a colony this newly settled. A swarm did not turn around and swarm again within its first month in a new home, not usually, not unless something had gone badly wrong, and nothing here had gone wrong at all. A second swarm found her, rather than the other way around, in the second week of June, smaller than the first and considerably less dramatic in its arrival. A scattering of perhaps a third the size of Otto's orchard swarm, discovered by Warren Colby clustered low in a fence-line hedge on his own property, and reported to Ada more out of curiosity than generosity, since Warren himself wanted nothing to do with catching it. Ada rode over with her skep and caught it alone this time, her hands remembering the motion Otto had shown her weeks before, and hived it that same evening in her second box exactly as she had the first, though she recorded honestly in her ledger that a June swarm by the old rhyme was worth only a silver spoon beside May's load of hay, and that she would not know for certain how strong this smaller colony truly was until high summer told her. July, when it came, brought the first real trouble of the season, and it came, as trouble on a farm most often does, from a direction Ada had not been watching closely enough. The main flow of white sweet clover that had carried both colonies through most of June slowed hard in the second week of July, the way it did most years in that stretch of Kestrel County, leaving a gap of several weeks before the later summer forage, the wild sunflower and the first asters along the creek bottom, came into bloom to carry the bees the rest of the way toward autumn. Otto had warned her about this gap, had called it by a plain unlovely name, the dearth, and had told her that a dearth was the single most dangerous stretch of the whole beekeeping year, for a young or a weak colony, more dangerous in its way than winter itself, because a strong hive with nothing left to forage would often turn its attention to a weaker neighbor's stores, instead of starving politely and waiting for the flowers to return. Ada had heard the warning and had meant to act on it, and had, in the crowded middle of a July that also demanded she get her small garden weeded and her wood laid in and a shirt mended for a trip into town she could not further postpone, let 3 critical days slip past without narrowing the entrance on her second, smaller colony, the one hived from Warren Colby's fence-line swarm in June, still building its strength, its comb only half drawn, its stores thin. She rode into Larkspur on a Thursday morning for sugar, plain white sugar, 4 pounds of it, at the ordinary price of 10 cents a pound, a purchase that felt almost funny to her even as she made it, spending money on sweetness for bees that were meant, eventually, to make sweetness for her, and returned in the early afternoon to a sound she had never heard from either hive before, a high, frantic, roaring hum, entirely unlike the low, contented drone of an ordinary working afternoon. She found the entrance to her second hive in chaos, bees wrestling in tight, furious pairs on the landing board, wax cappings torn loose and littering the ground in pale flakes, the whole colony's carefully drawn stores under open assault from what she would later understand, once Otto arrived and looked it over, was a mixed force of bees from her own stronger first colony and a wild population from somewhere else entirely, all of them drawn by the scent of exposed honey to a hive too weak and too wide-mouthed to defend itself. She did the only thing her few weeks of instruction had taught her to do in that moment. She narrowed the entrance by hand, jamming a folded scrap of leather into the gap until only the smallest crack remained, small enough that the weakened colony's own guards could hold the line one attacker at a time rather than a dozen at once. And she stood there in the failing afternoon light with her heart going hard, watching to see whether she had acted in time. She had mostly. Otto, arriving an hour later at her urgent word carried by the Colby boy, confirmed what she already feared. The colony had lost a significant portion of its hard-won early stores in that single afternoon. Weeks of careful foraging stripped out in under 2 hours, and though the robbing had stopped, the hive itself was now too thin on honey to be trusted to feed itself through to the next real bloom without help. Ada fed it that week, and the next with sugar syrup, boiled at home from the 4 pounds she had bought that same Thursday, plus 2 pounds more. She rode back into town for the following week. $1.40, spent altogether on sweetness for bees that had nearly starved defending sweetness they'd already made, an irony Ada noted in her ledger without allowing herself to laugh at it, not while the colony's survival was still in real doubt. "You will lose colonies," Otto told her, standing with her at the mended entrance while she fitted a proper wooden entrance reducer he had helped her carve that same evening from a scrap of oak, a notched block sized to leave only the narrowest defensible gap. "Every beekeeper loses colonies, every single year to something. Robbing, a queen that fails, a cold snap that catches a cluster too small. The measure of the thing is not whether you lose one. It is whether you learn fast enough not to lose two the same way." He told her, too, gruffly, that he had lost an entire hive to robbing himself in his second year in Nebraska, and had felt precisely as sick about it as she looked now, and that the feeling had never entirely stopped mattering to him even after 40 years, which she found, oddly, more comforting than any reassurance that the mistake was a small one. Word of the robbing reached town within the week, and Rufus Deakins, hearing a garbled version of it from someone who had heard it from someone else, made a point of remarking at Fenwick's counter that he'd heard the bee-woman's own bees had turned on each other, which he found about as fitting an end to the whole business as he could have imagined. Ada, arriving at the store herself not 10 minutes later for more sugar, caught the tail end of it and said nothing beyond ordering her purchase, though she noted the sting on the back of her own hand, earned in the scramble of jamming the entrance closed, her first real sting of the whole season, a brief hot welt that swelled and itched for 2 days and then faded, and thought that a woman who had survived grasshoppers and a bank of laughing men could survive being laughed at over one bad afternoon with her bees as well. The weakened hive recovered through the last half of July on the strength of the sugar syrup and the entrance reducer and, Ada suspected, a certain native stubbornness common to bees and to the women who kept them, and by the first week of August it had rebuilt enough of its stores that she judged it safely past the worst of the danger. It was her first, strongest colony, the one hived from Otto's orchard swarm back in May, now thriving on the head start its drawn comb had given it from the very first afternoon, that gave her the season's best proof that she had, in fact, begun to understand what she was doing. In the last days of July, checking that hive on her regular midday round, she found what Otto had taught her to recognize immediately: half a dozen queen cells hanging like small peanuts along the lower edge of 2 separate frames, a sure sign that the colony had grown crowded and strong enough to consider swarming on its own, exactly the way it had come to her from someone else's cottonwood tree 2 months before. She did not want to lose half of her best hive to the open sky, not when she had built it up from nothing but $9 and a stranger's kindness, and so she did the thing Otto had described to her, but that she had not yet tried alone. She watched the hive closely over the following days, and on the morning she found it unusually quiet, unusually still, with a scattering of bees clustered thick and restless just inside the entrance. She understood the swarm was imminent, and within the hour she found it. A fist-sized, then a hat-sized, then a full swarm's worth of bees gathering on a fence post not 40 yards from the hive itself, exactly as Otto had told her it would. Close to home, giving her time. She caught that swarm entirely alone, with a wash basin in place of Otto's borrowed skep and a steadiness in her own hands that surprised her more than it should have, and hived it that same evening in a 3rd box. her own now, not Simeon Ray's, built over 3 careful evenings from $1.20 of new pine bought expressly for the purpose. With frames she had learned to true and fit herself, no drawn comb waiting inside to give this colony the head start the first 2 had enjoyed, only bare wood and a colony's own labor ahead of it. She recorded the $1.20 in her ledger, and beneath it, 3rd hive, self-built. First swarm I caught with no one standing beside me. By the 2nd week of August, Ada Marsh owned 3 working colonies of honeybees, upright and provisioned, and, but for 1 hard week in July, entirely her own doing, standing in a neat row in the sheltered dip below her shanty, where 4 months earlier there had been nothing but a scrap of open ground and a stubborn idea. The county, so far as she could tell, was still laughing. She had stopped listening quite as closely as she once had, because for the first time since the grasshoppers came, she had begun to hear something else underneath it, the low, steady, productive hum of an answer being built 1 frame at a time, whether Kestrel County was ready to hear it yet or not. The main honey flow broke over all 3 colonies in the first 2 weeks of August, carried in on the white sweet clover that grew wild along every fence line and ditch bank in that end of Kestrel County. The same clover half the farmers in the district cursed as a weed choking their hay meadows, and none had ever once thought to look at as a crop in its own right. Ada watched her hives thicken with traffic through those weeks, the way she imagined a river watcher must watch a spring flood building. Each frame she checked heavier and whiter with new capped comb than the one before it. And she understood, watching it, that whatever the auction yard still believed about her, the bees themselves had already rendered their verdict. She learned to judge a frame's readiness the way Otto judged it, tipping it gently on its edge near her own ear and giving it the smallest shake, listening and watching at once. Nectar still too green and thin to keep would show itself instantly, a faint wet flash and sound at the cell mouths, while honey properly cured and capped over sat solid and silent under her hand, ready to come off the hive without ever running or spoiling in the jar. It was, Otto told her, the same test his own father had used in the old country, long before anyone had thought to build an instrument that could measure a honey's moisture more precisely than a careful ear and a patient hand. And Ada trusted it completely within a week of learning it. She built her section boxes that same August, small enough to nest 4 to a frame above the brood chamber, a full $1.20 of new pine bought and cut and nailed together over 2 long evenings, following as near as she could the description Otto remembered of the little glass-fronted boxes some of the finer eastern apiaries had begun using, though her own were plainer, unglazed pine, exactly suited to what she actually needed rather than to what she could not afford. A colony worked inside one of those small boxes the same way it worked any comb, building fresh white wax from nothing and filling it cell by cell with nectar it ripened and capped over in place, so that what came off the hive in September was not honey poured into a jar, but honey still living inside its own comb, sold whole, a small square of the summer itself sitting on Fenwick's shelf. Or so she allowed herself to imagine, though she had no arrangement with Fenwick at all as yet, and no particular reason to expect one. Not every frame went to sections. From her older, larger frames, the original drawn comb from Simeon Ray's 2 dead hives, now heavy with a second and even a 3rd generation of new honey layered over the old, she cut squares of capped comb directly with a long, thin knife, crushed them in a clean cloth over a wide crock, and let the whole mass drain slowly through the weave overnight and into the next day. Gravity alone pulling clear, pale golden liquid honey down into the crock, while the crushed wax and empty cappings stayed behind in the cloth. It was rougher work than the sections, and it ruined the comb it came from rather than preserving it whole, but it moved faster and it filled jars rather than boxes, and Ada judged, doing the arithmetic by lamplight, that she would want both kinds before the year was through. The sections for show, and for the buyer who wanted something finer, the plain strained honey in glass for the buyer who wanted sweetness, and did not much care what shape it came in. The crushed wax itself, wrung nearly dry in the cloth and then rendered a second time over a low fire in a pot of water, cooled at last into pale gold cakes she poured into the bottom of clean tin cans to set. And though she had not planned for it as carefully as the honey, she found by the end of August that she had nearly 4 pounds of clean-rendered beeswax sitting on a shelf in her shed, worth, by Otto's estimate, something near 90 cents a pound to the right buyer, a candle maker or a harness shop wanting it for waxing thread. And she added the figure to her ledger under a new heading she had not needed before that summer: wax rendered for sale. The actual work of taking a full-section box off the hive taught her, in its first attempt, a lesson about patience that no amount of Otto's talking had quite prepared her for. She pulled her first finished section on a hot afternoon in the 3rd week of August, prying it loose from its neighbors with more haste than the job wanted, and cracked one corner of the delicate new comb doing it, losing perhaps a 1/4 pound of honey to a slow ooze before she managed to right it and set it level. She did not make the same mistake twice. By her second harvest day, 4 days later, she had learned to work each section free with the flat of her hive tool eased in slow along every edge before ever lifting it clear, and to carry each finished box level in both hands the way a person carries a filled cup across a room, and the sections that came off her hives after that first costly afternoon came off clean, square, and whole, the pale wax cappings glowing faintly translucent in the sunlight, the way Otto had told her a truly finished piece of comb honey ought to glow. For the strained honey, she uncapped the older frames with a long, thin blade warmed first in a pan of hot water, slicing the wax cappings free in a single continuous ribbon the way she had seen it pictured in the book Fenwick had ordered for her, and found, doing it herself for the first time, a particular satisfaction in watching a whole season's worth of capped, hidden honey come open under a warm blade all at once, gold catching the afternoon light in a way that made the 11 weeks of work behind it feel, for exactly as long as the slicing lasted, entirely worth it. By the time she judged the main flow finished, in the 2nd week of September, Ada had pulled 11 full-section boxes and enough crushed comb to fill 9-quart jars of strained honey, a total yield that Otto, walking the row with her on a cool evening to look it over, called remarkable for a first season built on 2 dead boxes and a stranger's kindness, though he cautioned her in the same breath that a beekeeper judged a colony's health by what it kept for itself as much as by what it gave up, and that she would need to leave a fair portion of that same harvest sitting exactly where the bees had put it if she wanted 3 living colonies come April rather than 3 empty boxes and a hard lesson about greed. She weighed what she could on the small kitchen scale she used for canning, and did the sums that evening with the same care she gave every other figure in her book. Something near 60 pounds of finished comb in the 11 sections, and close to 40 more pounds of strained honey once the jars were topped and sealed, 100 pounds of sweetness, near enough, produced in one summer by 3 colonies that had cost her, all told, $9. $1.20 in section lumber, $1.40 in emergency sugar, $1.10 in a mail order book, and $1.20 in pine for a 3rd box she had built with her own 2 hands. At the ordinary price honey commanded in a county that still had its sugar, 8 to 10 cents a pound, the whole 100 pounds would have brought her somewhere between $8 and $10. A fair return, nothing spectacular, the kind of number that would have satisfied her without changing much of anything. She had no way of knowing yet, totaling that figure by lamplight in the 2nd week of September, that the ordinary price was not the price her honey was going to fetch that particular winter, or that the difference between 8 cents and 25 would turn out to be the whole of the story still left to tell. Iris Colby was the first person outside of Otto Brandt to pay Ada Marsh actual money for anything her bees had made, and she did it in the end, almost by accident, riding past on her way into Larkspur one Saturday in late August and stopping at the fence out of nothing more than the same curiosity that had put a hand over her mouth back in March. "Is it true you've got honey now?" Iris asked her, not quite a question, standing at the fence rail in nearly the same spot her husband had stood laughing 5 months before. "Real honey, from those boxes?" Ada brought her a jar of the strained comb honey without a word, cut her a taste on a clean spoon, and watched Iris Colby's face do the thing Ada had begun to hope, quietly, that more faces would do before the year was out. A startled stillness, followed by something that was almost embarrassment at how good a thing could be that she had laughed at only months before. Iris bought a full jar that afternoon for 30 cents, the first coin Ada had ever taken in exchange for anything her bees had made, and rode on into town with it wrapped in a cloth on the seat beside her, and Ada stood at her own fence for a long moment afterward, holding 30 cents in her palm, feeling the particular specific weight of a first sale in a way that made the coin feel heavier than its size. Otto would not take payment at all, no matter how she pressed him, and settled the argument the way he settled most arguments with her by then, simply by changing the terms of it. He would take no money, he said, but he would gladly trade a length of good rope and a morning's help mending her south fence for 2 jars of the honey and 1 small section box. And Ada, recognizing when she had lost a negotiation to a man who had already decided its shape, agreed and recorded the trade in her ledger, by its fair value rather than by the coin that never actually changed hands, because a ledger that only counted coins, she had decided, was a ledger that lied about half of what a year's work was actually worth. Word moved after that the way Otto had told her it would, through the women first, the way it nearly always did in a county where the men gathered at the store and the women gathered at church suppers and quilting circles and the wash line strung between 2 neighboring properties. And by the second week of September, Ada had sold, in small amounts to 5 different families she had barely spoken to before that summer, better than $3 worth of honey and wax combined, a sum that would have seemed laughably small to her back in March, and now sat in her ledger as the first real proof, however modest, that a product with no buyer was only a hobby, and a product with even a handful of buyers was the beginning of something else entirely. Not every ear in the county was friendly to the news. It was Rufus Deakins, riding past the ragged aftermath of July's robbing before Ada had a chance to fully clean the ground beneath the recovered hive, who first put words to a rumor that would cost her more trouble that autumn than the robbing itself had. He had seen, he told 2 men at Fenwick's counter, wax and dead bees scattered thick around one of her hives. Exactly, he said, the way a body heard tell foulbrood left a hive looking, and he wondered aloud, where enough people could hear him wonder it, whether the bee-woman's honey was entirely safe for a Christian table. The rumor reached Ada by way of Iris Colby, who rode out specially to tell her rather than let her hear it second-hand and worse, and Ada felt, hearing it, a colder version of the fear she had felt narrowing that entrance back in July, because a rumor about disease could undo in a week what 5 months of careful, patient work had only just begun to build. She rode to Otto's that same afternoon, and Otto, hearing it, did not comfort her so much as he simply told her what to do, in the flat, practical tone of a man who had watched bad information cost good farmers real money before. "We do not argue with a rumor," he said. "We open the hive in front of witnesses and let them see for themselves, because a lie about bees dies the moment an honest man looks inside the box, and lives forever if he never does." He rode with her to Warren Colby's place 2 days later, and Warren and Iris, and at Otto's own quiet insistence, Rufus Deakins himself, stood at a careful distance while Ada lifted 3 frames from the recovered hive, worked the ropey matchstick test on a fresh cell in front of all 4 of them, showed them the clean, tight brood pattern and the capped honey and the ordinary, healthy hum of a colony that had recovered exactly as a colony recovers from a bad week rather than a bad disease. Deakins said little, examined the frame Otto handed him for longer than Ada expected, and rode off without apologizing, which she had not expected either, though the rumor itself, so far as she could ever trace it, went no further than that afternoon. She turned her attention, through the last weeks of September, to the two obligations that had sat underneath everything else all summer: Fenwick's $17.65, and the coming winter her 3 colonies would need to survive before any of the rest of it would matter at all. The honey and wax sales, modest as they still were, had brought her ledger's income column to just past $9 by the last week of September, and she made the deliberate decision, sitting at her table one evening with both figures in front of her, to hold nothing back. She sold the remainder of her earliest strained honey to 2 more families down the Larkspur Road inside of 4 days, scraped together every coin the operation had produced since May, added it to what little she had saved from her garden and her hens across the same months, and rode into town on the first Saturday of October, a full month ahead of the first snow deadline Fenwick himself had set, to settle the account in full. She counted it onto his counter the way she counted everything, coin by coin, $17.65 exactly, and watched Otis Fenwick's face move through 3 distinct expressions in the space of about 4 seconds. Surprise, a flicker of something that might have been calculation, and finally a kind of grudging, wordless respect that he covered by making a great show of checking the sum against his own ledger before marking her account closed and settled. "Didn't expect you'd manage it," he said, which was as near to a compliment as she had yet heard cross that counter, and Ada told him only that she kept careful books, and left it there, because a debt paid in full needed no further speech to make its point. She spent the first 2 weeks of October preparing her 3 hives for the winter ahead exactly as Otto had taught her, hefting each hive by hand to judge its stored weight, and leaving every colony no less than 25 pounds of its own honey untouched, even as she took what surplus she safely could, because a colony that starved in February for want of stores she had greedily harvested in September was a loss no amount of careful bookkeeping could excuse. She stacked hay bales in a low windbreak along the north and west sides of the little apiary, fitted each hive with its narrowest entrance reducer to hold the worst of the wind out, and, just as importantly, to keep field mice from creeping in to nest in the warm cluster over the winter months, and banked loose straw against the outer walls of each box for insulation, the way Otto's own father had banked his skeps against a German winter 2 generations before either of them had ever seen Nebraska. The work took 2 cold, clear October days, Pip circling worriedly the whole time and Jasper hauling hay bales up from the low field. She checked each hive's final weight by lifting gently at the back corner the way Otto had shown her. A hive that lifted easily was dangerously light on stores, while one that resisted, heavy and solid, would likely see its bees through to April. All 3 colonies lifted heavy that final afternoon, which she recorded with more relief than she let herself show, because she had read enough, in Otto's stories and in the mail-order book both, of beekeepers who lost a whole apiary in one bad February, to know how much still rode on 3 wooden boxes surviving cold they could not be helped through once the snow came down. She stood at the fence a long while that evening, listening to the faint, sleepy hum still rising from inside each hive, quieter now but unmistakably alive, and thought that most of the real work a person did in a hard season was invisible from any distance greater than about 3 feet, and entirely worth doing anyway. By the last day of October, her ledger showed $17.65, paid in full, a fresh season's worth of honey and wax still on hand and mostly unsold, 3 colonies provisioned and wrapped against the cold, and a small, stubborn, wholly private conviction that she had done so far exactly what she had set out to do 7 months before, with $9 sewn into the lining of a glove. What she did not know yet, riding home from that last October errand with an empty wagon and a closed account, was that 30 miles east, on the low-water crossing that carried nearly every wagon load of store goods into Kestrel County from the railhead, the autumn rains had already begun to swell a creek that had never given the county serious trouble before, and that Otis Fenwick's own shelves and every other shelf in Larkspur were about to run short of the one thing a Nebraska winter had never yet made them do without. The crossing washed out for good in the second week of November, taking the better part of a plank bridge with it. And by the time the county road crew had assessed the damage and sent word to the railhead that repairs would take the better part of a month, the freight wagons that carried flour and coffee and coal oil and, above all, barreled white sugar into Larkspur had already missed 2 scheduled runs in a row, with a third looking doubtful. It would not have mattered so badly in an ordinary year, Otis Fenwick told anyone who asked him at his own counter, if it hadn't landed square on the 2 months of the whole calendar when a general store's sugar barrel worked hardest. The tail end of the preserving season, when the last of the county's apples and late garden tomatoes still wanted putting up in syrup before a hard freeze took them, and the run-up to Christmas, when every farmhouse in Kestrel County wanted sugar for cakes and candy, and the dozen other small sweetnesses that made a prairie Christmas feel like Christmas rather than one more cold, gray day. By the first week of December, Fenwick's sugar barrel sat empty in the corner of the store where it had stood full for as long as anyone could remember, and the hand-lettered sign he tacked up in the front window, "No sugar, next shipment uncertain," became, for a few miserable weeks, the most quoted piece of writing in the entire county. Ada heard about the shortage same as everyone else, secondhand at first, and then, once she rode in herself for a spool of thread in the second week of December, with her own eyes, the barrel empty, the shelf behind it bare but for a few tins of molasses Fenwick was rationing to 1 per family, and 3 women at the counter in a conversation that stopped dead the moment Ada came through the door, though not, this time, because of her. They had simply been discussing, with the grim resignation of women facing down a holiday with half its usual ingredients missing, what on earth they were meant to do about the Christmas baking with not a pound of white sugar to be had within 40 miles. Ada did not say anything in the store that day about the 11 full-section boxes and the 6-quart jars of strained honey still sitting, unsold and unremarked, on the shelves of her own small shed. She had not yet worked out, standing there listening to Fenwick apologize for the 3rd time that week to a disappointed customer, exactly what she meant to do with them, only that the shape of an answer was beginning to form. The same quiet, patient way an idea had once formed itself in an auction yard over 2 dead beehives nobody else had wanted. It was Iris Colby again, who carried the first real word of it, telling 2 neighbor women at a Sunday gathering, almost as an aside, that the Marsh girls' honey sweetened a cup of coffee just as well as sugar ever had and stretched twice as far besides, and that she herself had been baking with nothing else for a month, and no one at her table had noticed the difference. The trickle began within the week, a wagon Ada did not recognize pulling up to her gate on a Tuesday afternoon, a woman she had met perhaps twice in 4 years asking, a little sheepishly, whether it was true she had honey to sell, and would she take 15 cents for a small jar. Ada sold it to her, and to the 2 families who came the following day, and to a widow from the far side of the county who had heard about it from her own married daughter and driven an hour and a half on the strength of that alone, and by the 3rd week of December she had moved better than $4 worth of strained honey in small sales at her own gate without ever once riding into Larkspur to advertise a single jar of it. She raised her price twice that same month, plainly and without apology, first from 15 cents a jar to 20, and then, once it became clear that demand was not merely holding but growing, to a figure closer to what Otto had told her, back in August, that comb honey ought to fetch in a county with no sugar at all. 25 cents a pound for the finished sections, a price that would have struck anyone in that county as close to robbery back in March, and struck nobody at all as unreasonable by the 3rd week of December, because a county with no sugar had, in the space of 6 short weeks, entirely revised its own arithmetic of what sweetness was worth. She kept every sale in her ledger exactly as she kept everything else. And on the night before the 4th Sunday of December, she sat at her table and added the column and found, with a kind of quiet, private satisfaction she allowed herself to feel, for exactly as long as it took to write the number down, that her honey and wax, sold almost entirely at her own gate to families who had once laughed at her or said nothing while their husbands did, had brought in just short of $11 in that 1 month alone. More than her entire $9 investment, doubled in 28 days, with 11 section boxes and most of a second jar run still unsold, and word of the county's only sweetener still spreading a little farther every single day. Otis Fenwick came out to her claim himself on the last Tuesday before Christmas, riding alone rather than driving his delivery wagon, which Ada noted the moment she saw him coming up the track, because a man riding alone to conduct business he was not entirely certain would go his way was a different animal from the man who had laughed loudest in an auction yard 9 months before. He tied his horse at her fence, the same fence her own words to deacons and to half the county had crossed a dozen times that year, and stood there a moment longer than the cold called for, turning his hat once in his hands before he spoke. "Miss Marsh," he said, and there was none of the old performing laughter left in it at all. "I expect you've heard my sugar barrel's been sitting empty since the 1st of the month." "I'd heard," Ada said, and did not make it easier for him than it needed to be, because she had earned, she felt, the right to let a silence sit exactly as long as it wanted to. "I've got customers asking me most days now whether I know anything about the honey the Marsh place is selling," he went on, turning the hat again. "Women coming through my own front door repeating your prices back to me like I'm the one who ought to be embarrassed about it. I'll say it plain, since plain seems to be the only way you and I have ever done business. I'd like to stock your honey and your wax, both at the store, on whatever terms you find fair, and I'd like to place a standing order for however much you can supply between now and the next real bloom." She did not gloat, though the thought crossed her mind, and she let it pass through without holding on to it. Because gloating, she had decided somewhere over the long course of that year, cost a person something in the end that was worth more than the brief pleasure of it. She named her price instead, plainly. 25 cents a pound for the comb sections, 20 cents a pound for the strained honey and glass, cash on delivery, and no store credit extended against it in either direction, and a forward order in writing for every pound she could produce through the winter and into the spring bloom, at the same fixed prices regardless of whether the bridge was ever repaired or the railroad ever caught up on its shipments. Fenwick was quiet for a long moment, doing the same arithmetic in his head that she had once watched freight men do in the trade she'd only heard described to her, weighing what he stood to gain against what it cost his pride to stand at her fence and ask for it. "Cash," he said at last, "and no credit either direction. Those are hard terms, Miss Marsh." "They're fair terms," she said. "You taught me what a closed account feels like from the wrong side of a counter. I've no wish to teach it back to you, but I'll not extend what I can't afford to lose, and you've got customers standing in your store this week with money in their hands and nothing to spend it on. I'd say the terms favor us both." He agreed. 3 days later, on the Friday before Christmas, Ada loaded her wagon with 11 section boxes and a full case of jarred, strained honey and drove it herself into Larkspur, and word had traveled fast enough by then that a small knot of townspeople, drawn by nothing more than curiosity and the plain fact that there was little else to do in a sugar-starved December, had gathered near the store's front window to watch the delivery happen. Fenwick counted the coin out onto his own counter in front of all of them. $24.40 for that first delivery alone, more cash than Ada had held in her 2 hands at one time in the whole of her 4 years on the claim. And Ada counted it a second time behind him, aloud, the way she counted everything, and wrote the figure into her ledger right there at his counter, with half the town looking on, because she had learned, a long while back now, that a number said aloud in front of witnesses was worth twice what the same number was worth whispered. The forward order Fenwick signed that same afternoon committed him to purchasing every pound of honey and every cake of wax Ada could produce through the winter and into the following season's first bloom at her fixed prices for a projected total, by his own rough figuring and hers, of somewhere near $36 more before the snow was even off the ground. A sum that struck Ada, reading it back to herself that evening by lamplight, as very nearly unbelievable set against the $9 that had started the whole account, and entirely believable set against every hour of work that had stood between the one number and the other. It was Rufus Deakins, of all people, who came to her gate first among the men who had laughed loudest that March morning, arriving on a bright, cold day in the second week of January with his hat in his hands, in a rough approximation of the same posture Fenwick had struck at her fence 3 weeks before, asking, with considerably less polish than Fenwick had managed, whether it was true a person could buy a start of bees from her, a queen and a few frames of brood and workers both, to build up a hive of their own for the coming season. $4 for a nucleus, Ada told him. If you can wait until May, when I've got increase enough to spare without weakening what I'm already running. Deakins agreed to the price without arguing it, which she noted, and paid $1 down against it that same afternoon, which she also noted, and rode away with considerably less to say for himself than he had managed in March, though he did pause at the gate long enough to allow, gruffly, that he supposed he'd misjudged what $9 could do in the right hands, which was as close to an apology as Ada expected ever to receive from him, and she decided close enough to satisfy her. He was not the last. Through the remainder of that winter, 5 more men who had stood in that auction yard and laughed, among them 2 who had never spoken a word to her before that March, and one who had gone so far as to offer loudly to buy her $9 back off her at a profit if she'd only admit the joke had gone far enough, came to her gate with deposits against nucleus colonies for the spring, until her ledger showed better than $18 in advance orders for bees alone. Against colonies she had not yet even split from her own thriving hives, sold to the very men whose laughter she could still hear, some winter evenings, as clearly as she'd heard it in March. Ezra Pike himself came to her gate in February, not for bees but for honey, 2 jars for his own household, and paid her asking price without haggling, the same auctioneer's voice that had once read her bid back to her twice in disbelief now remarking, as he counted out his coin, that he had sold a great many strange lots over a great many years running sales in that county, but that hers was the first one he could recall where the joke had turned around 360 degrees and ended up facing the man who told it. Ada told him she remembered exactly what he'd said that March morning, word for word, and Pike had the good grace to laugh at himself rather than at her, and rode off with his 2 jars wrapped in cloth on the seat beside him, and Ada added his coin to the ledger under a heading that had grown, by February, to nearly 2 full pages of names she had once known only as faces in a laughing crowd. By the time the county's small agricultural fair convened that August, a full year and a season on from the Wray auction, Ada entered 3 things she would never have imagined entering the year before: a section of her comb honey, a cake of her rendered wax, and, at Otto's quiet insistence, the same battered box lid from one of Simeon Ray's original hives, cleaned and displayed beside the honey as what Otto called, with the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen cross his face, proof of the whole argument. The honey took a blue ribbon in a category the fair committee had to invent that year because no one had ever before submitted comb honey worth judging, and Ada stood in the Grange Hall accepting it from a committee that had, a year and a half before, very likely laughed along with everyone else at the story of the $9, and felt receiving it considerably less than she might have expected to feel, because the ribbon, satisfying as it was, only confirmed in public a thing her own ledger had already told her in private months before. The verdict that mattered to her had been rendered on Otis Fenwick's counter in December in coin. The ribbon was only Kestrel County catching up to the arithmetic. By the time the wildflowers came back to the ridge above her, claim the following May, 1 year almost to the week since she had raised her hand in a stranger's dooryard and paid $9 for what the whole county had called nothing, Ada Marsh stood in a bee yard that held 7 working hives instead of 2 dead ones, the original pair from Simeon Ray's estate standing at the head of the row still, weathered now but sound, flanked by 5 more she had built or split herself over the 12 months between. every one of them humming with the low, contented, productive sound she had once heard drifting across her mother's Ohio garden, and had spent a whole hard year teaching herself to recognize as the sound of an answer rather than a danger. She walked the row most evenings that spring at exactly the golden hour Otto had first shown her mattered, when the low sun came in flat and warm across the ridge and lit the hive boxes amber and gold, and threw her own long shadow out across grass that 4 years before had grown nothing but sagebrush and a stubborn, unprofitable hope. The $17.65 that had once felt on a hard October evening like the whole weight of her survival was a figure so far behind her now that she sometimes had to open an old page of the ledger to remember it exactly, and the $9 that had started it all sat at the top of that same page in her own careful hand, small and plain and entirely unremarkable beside the columns of figures that had grown up around it since. She sat down with the full ledger on a quiet evening in that same May, the way she had sat down with it a year of Mays before, and added the whole of it from the beginning, the way she had promised herself, that first lonely night with the 2 dead boxes cooling outside her door, that she would eventually do. $9 spent at the Wray auction, 95 cents for netting and pine that first spring, $1.10 for a mail-order book, $1.20 for section box lumber, $1.40 for sugar syrup that saved a robbed and weakened hive in July, $1.20 more for a 3rd box, self-built. Against it, $17.65 in an old debt paid in full a full month early. Just short of $11 in gate sales in a single December alone. $24.40 counted on to Otis Fenwick's own counter for one first delivery, with $36 more standing behind it in writing. $18 in deposits against bees, not yet even divided from the hives that would supply them. Beeswax sold by the pound to a larkspur harness shop for a further $3.60. She added it all, checked the sum twice the way she checked everything, and sat for a long moment looking at a final figure that came, by her own careful count, to just past $97 documented, honest, and accounted for, against a $9 joke the whole county had once laughed at in a single trampled dooryard. She did not frame the number. She was not by nature a woman who framed things. But she did keep, on a shelf in her front room where she could see it from her own chair by the fire, one of the 2 original box lids from Simeon Ray's Dead Hives, cleaned and oiled and never used again once she'd built better equipment of her own. Sitting now beside a full jar of honey she had decided, without any particular ceremony, was not for selling. A reminder she told Otto once when he asked her about it, of exactly how little the truth of a thing has to do with what a crowd decides to believe about it on the morning they first lay eyes on it. She was not rich, not by the measure the Eastern papers meant when they wrote about fortunes, and she did not expect to be not soon, not from bees alone. She was still up before 4 most mornings. She still lost a colony here and there to a bad queen or a hard cold snap, still fed syrup through a dearth, still watched her ledger as closely in success as she ever had in want, because she had learned, across one very long year, that the watching itself was most of what had ever separated her from the county that laughed at her, not luck, not daring, only the plain, stubborn habit of looking closely at a thing everyone else had already decided wasn't worth a second glance. Kestrel County no longer called her the woman who bought dead bees. Mostly now they just called her Miss Marsh, or, increasingly, simply asked her opinion on their own hives, which she gave freely, the way Otto Brandt had once given his to her, for nothing more than the company and the sight of one more rocky, unwanted corner of that county finally put to work. If this story earned an hour of your evening, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and tell the algorithm you'd like another one. There are 9 more just like it waiting. Every one of them built on a different worthless bargain and a different real craft, and I promise you the arithmetic never adds up until, eventually, it does. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of this one. I'll see you in the next.